If you're in town this Saturday, we would love for you to join us from 10 to noon on the deck of the 5th floor of our building, the education building, that one of our buildings, for pastries on the patio, or as Matt calls it, donuts with the dean. There will be yummy goodies there, so come join us 10 to 12 for the parade and all that good stuff. And then in I don't know, what's today? 10 to 20 days or so, we are kicking off a new campaign at the University of Idaho. Not kicking it off, we're launching the next part of our campaign, Brave, Bold, and Unstoppable. And so we have an opportunity to hear a little bit more about that campaign. I'm going to encourage everybody to join us on October 20th, which is a Thursday afternoon at 5 o'clock in the ICC. We kind of kick off explaining what that part of the capital campaign will be, what our role will be as faculty and staff across the university. So join me if you will, 5 o'clock, and we will be talking with your supervisors and all of that good stuff about ways that we can make that easier for you to attend, whether that looks like coming in late, whatever that will time off at another point in time. The president and provost are very interested that we have as many folks at that event as possible. And then a couple other things, we've got 2 more intramural seminars this semester. The one in October 24th, will focus on the work of CDHD, and then in November, Matt and I will be sharing a little bit more about the capital campaign and our college's part of the capital campaign. So without further ado, let's get to what we're really here for today, to hear a little bit more about the work that TRIO Inspire is doing. So a lot of you know about this work, but there are plenty of us in this room who don't, and online, so we're really thrilled to hear more about it. So Ariel Haran is the director of the Silver Valley Upward Bound program out of the Coeur d'Alene Center, and she's been with TRIO Inspire since 2012. She has a BA in Art Education from Colorado State University and an MS in Academic Advising Administration from Kansas State University. Prior to TRIO, she worked as an art teacher in Aurora, Colorado, and then in Fort Polk, Louisiana. And Ariel is currently a doctoral candidate pursuing an ED in Educational Technology from Boise State University, with a focus on rural distance education and the technological impact of mobile devices. Certainly an area of interest at research that we really need. So we'll welcome Ariel to come share a little bit more. Thank you.
All right, let me get my technology set up here. While I'm getting this going, just out of casual curiosity, Heather and I were talking and asked some of you folks, how many of you that went to grad school went out of spite, partially? That's some of your reasons. Interesting. Okay, just wondering. That has no bearing on my presentation. I'm going to go ahead and get going here. This is really nice because obviously, as we just mentioned, I just found out yesterday I passed my comps, so really excited about that. This is also really nice because this is not my school. I'm going to Boise State, so none of y'all are judging me in here. This is just like a nice dry run. I can practice this and kind of talk about what I'm looking at. So today I'm going to be talking to you about my anticipated research proposal, and a lot of this is going to be about examining the impact between smartphone ownership on online K-12 education in rural America. Actually, this is what my comps were, a literature review that I completed over the summer. And so a lot of that literature review was a little bit zoomed out. I did have to look at more rural K-12 online education, just because this is a topic that is so niche. There are probably fewer than 10 studies on this. And so we don't really have a lot of information that we can talk about in kind of general terms. But what we do know is that the digital divide in the United States is growing. So current research demonstrates that there is a significant gap across socioeconomic and geographic lines. Overall, all Americans are increasing their rates of technology adoption, but across the board, rural Americans are lagging behind suburban and urban counterparts in terms of stable broadband internet connections, in terms of PC and laptop ownership, and especially in terms of tablet ownership. However, across all income levels, most rural Americans do rely on their smartphones to access the internet. Research on rural K-12 educational technology in the United States is sparse, with only a few studies addressing smartphone impact in this context. So ultimately, while smartphones play increasingly significant roles in the lives of rural Americans, there's just not a whole lot known about their impact on students, teachers, and school systems. So to give you just a little brief history, rural education and distance learning in the United States have a super long history. This goes back well over a century and pretty much aligns with the rise of industrialization, which of course we know started a trend of depopulation in rural areas. And of course, this is still continuing to this day. Globalization continues to impact these communities and has led a lot of them to this boom and bust cycle that's tied to natural resources. Unfortunately, this boom and bust cycle has led to a pretty pronounced brain drain phenomenon, which can perpetuate a cycle of economic decline in these rural communities. So to combat this cycle, distance learning has been proposed for a long time. You're probably familiar with correspondence courses. You clip the coupon back out of the comic book and you send it in and you learn taxidermy. Or, you know, you might be familiar with, if you're my age, you might be familiar with software learning in the Oregon Trail, playing that. Oh, share screen on Zoom, thank you. I will do that. So anyway, it's taken a lot of different formats over time. Can the Zoom folks see this now? Okay. All right, I'll keep going. She says no. Okay. I don't seem to maybe have that ability on here. Here we go. All right, we good now?
I saw the blue highlight.
Okay. Great. So going back a slide, basically, sorry you guys, I am in like window and window and window here. Okay. So backing up, we were talking about the Oregon Trail and what a great game it was. But ultimately, you know, this has taken on a ton of different forms, but we really didn't see online learning sort of take off until the 1990s, and even then it wasn't until the last 2 decades that we've really seen online learning take off and kind of take the form that it does now. So we know it's common for students in all areas to take courses online, but rural schools do use these courses differently simply because rural schools have their own issues that urban and suburban schools don't. So for one, many rural school districts rely on distance learning to provide their students with the classes necessary to meet state requirements for graduation. And this is often because they're unable to recruit teachers for hard to fill positions in particularly STEM education. Another issue is rurality itself. Obviously, we know that a lot of rural communities are geographically isolated. What this can translate into is fewer or more expensive options for high-speed internet, especially compared to folks that live in suburbs or urban areas. And again, this translates into more rural Americans relying on their cellular networks or smartphones for internet access, especially those in low-income households. So while we know that satellite internet and Starlink are really exciting technologies, unfortunately, the expense for these are still pretty high, and especially again for those in low-income households. And then finally, there's just really a notable lack of research in rural education in general. So best estimates place 1/4 of all students in the United States attending a rural school, but less than 6% of all educational research is focused on those schools. So everybody's favorite topic, of course, is COVID, but we really can't talk about this without going over the past couple of years. So kind of what happened during COVID is a lot of us who work in rural education started to see some kind of unusual things happening. And we started to see or hear about stories where students were taking whole courses on their smartphones. Or those who had to drive like 30 minutes to get to their closest McDonald's to get Wi-Fi because they live in such a rural area, they can't even get a cell phone signal. And it's like, wow, this is really interesting. And so many of us have these stories, but we just don't have like data on this right now. And I think, well, a lot of us think like, great, we're kind of moving back to normal. These issues still haven't gone away. Even if students are still going back to school and accessing the internet there, the connectivity issues at their homes are still persisting. And this is leading in many cases to a significant. So with this anecdotal evidence, there just isn't enough up-to-date baseline data on rural online learning for school administrators and other policymakers to understand how these students are accessing the internet and how it's impacting their education. The last major large-scale national quantitative study on rural online education was done in 2009, and this is referenced and referenced and referenced all the time, but the world looks really different than it did in 2009, and so this is a little bit outdated. So in a nutshell, we know that a lot of rural people use their smartphones for internet access, and we definitely know that students have been using them for education, but we don't see what that relationship is or what the impacts are. So some of you familiar with ed tech might be wondering, why not just use studies regarding broader smartphone use? And something that I just want to highlight here is that there are adequate studies on student smartphone use in general settings and in post-secondary settings, but the reason that we want to focus in on rural and K-12 is because, again, these rural schools use these courses differently. So in urban or suburban areas, a lot of these schools are not relying on online courses for general education. They're offering these for AP or IB or dual credit purposes, and the students who elect to take these courses are often already sufficiently motivated to do well in them. Conversely, in some rural schools, and I'm thinking like, there are some that we have in the state that have 4 students in their graduating classes. And some of these schools, online courses might be the only way that the schools can offer general education classes. And that means that the majority of those students in that school are taking online courses regardless of their motivation, their abilities, their home internet access, or what devices they have at home. So they're essentially caught in what we call a digital bind environment, which is typified by the requirement that they do coursework online or using technology, but the school can't guarantee access to that. So given that I just passed my exam and I can move forward, I expect to develop a research proposal with the 2 following broad questions. First is, how are rural schools using online education overall? And second is, how has smartphone ownership impacted online education in rural schools? Question 1, it was answered in that 2009 study that I referenced. However, like a lot of studies that deal with technology, it's just becoming outdated, especially post-COVID-19. The second question, to the best of my knowledge, this has fewer than 10 studies currently published that are relevant, but those have been pretty geographically specific and not necessarily generalizable to larger populations. So the anticipated methodology is an exploratory sequential mixed method study. I hope to first conduct a qualitative phase with some focus groups with staff from rural schools, and just kind of find out what they're knowing, what they're seeing, and what kind of needs to be discussed, and then follow up with that with a survey development that would be a modification of that 2009 study that more specifically addresses smartphone use and some of those topics I mentioned. So potential impacts of this research might include providing rural education teachers with a more up-to-date set of baseline data on rural schools' usage of online education. And potentially at the university level, this could inform some of the teacher preparation programs. It could provide us with additional information on how to work with students from rural communities, and even potentially influence instructional design to accommodate those who rely on mobile devices. And future research options could be investigating student experience of using smartphones for online education. Currently, there's a pretty significant lack of student experience in the literature. Examining student performance based on device use, or even potentially looking at, I think this is really exciting, looking at device nativity and developing place-based education connections, particularly given that remote work has become increasingly available in rural communities. So that's it. I am sorry that I went over time with my technological problems, but I think we're taking questions for the end.
I think let's take them now because it's relevant.
Okay.
I think it makes more sense. So why don't we have like 5 minutes for questions for Ariel, if you have them. Because otherwise we might forget what you said.
I was hoping Heather would answer my questions.
I know. This is practice for that dissertation proposal. Okay, got one question.
What areas geographically, how are you going to figure out how you want to approach that? Being, Idaho's not a huge state, but there are.
What I want to do is I want to take NCES, National Center for Education Statistics, and take their lists for our list and REAP, which is Rural Low Income Schools and Rural Education Achievement Program, and take those lists, randomly select from those, and get schools from all over the United States that are represented across those programs. So we can get some general rural schools, and then we'd also proportionally represent those that are very small schools or those that are low income schools. Yes.
Following this question and a prior question, the population, do you know specifically the ages group?
I think that this would mostly be focused on high school students. There's a little bit less evidence of elementary and middle schools using these, although it certainly could be part of the proposal to ask at a district level to what extent all of the schools are using that.
So could you help us understand how this vision study fits into what you're doing at TRIO? What's the connection there?
A lot of the connection is just seeing the students, as I mentioned, that we're starting to use their smartphones for taking these courses, or in one case, we went and bought we used our grant funds to purchase some hotspots. And, in TRIO, we don't have a whole lot of money to spend on these things, but we got two, and the plan was to start lending them out to students, and it quickly just became something that it was like, there's no way that we can do this equitably, because there were so many students in our target area that were in need of a hotspot. And so we invested in Chromebooks, and it's like, this is great, we can check these out, but the cost and the recurring expenses and subscription for the hotspot was like, wow, we can't do this. And so we started asking them, can you use your phone? Can you make this as a hotspot instead? And started learning of so many that, especially in our programs, that were saying, this is the only internet that I use at home. Or my family all shares one cell phone at home, or this is the only, we all share one plan and we all get on one person's Wi-Fi. And so that was just so interesting to me to learn about kind of these rural TRIO students. And we find that in TRIO, rural students are not well represented in our programs anyway. So I think that this would kind of inform some of our slow, tortuously slow movements to kind of adopt new technology and accommodate students where we meet them online. Okay.
I have a question. I'm sorry. One more. And then we'll transition to my questions first.
Yeah, for your presentation.
How about this notion of, so if there's a need for, I don't know, I guess people online can hear us. Is that true? People hear us online? Okay, good. What is the funding opportunity to help these rural communities with connectivity? And have we researched any of that?
So the FCC does have the E-rate program, which can help make broadband available to rural communities, but that's kind of a difficult program to navigate, because one of the things that happens in these communities is that like the denial rate for an E-rate school to get connected is like 6% on average, but when you look at rural communities, it's like 30%. It's crazy high, because you look at some of our communities in Idaho, and it's like, well, how am I going to run broadband over these mountains or through the mountains or things like that? So that is possible, but geography is frequently difficult. I do know that they are working with some revisions to the FCC E-rate program currently, and I think that they were considering Starlink, although I think that was just recently rejected. So I'm not certain what the status is right now. I think it's still being reviewed.
Question I have to ask. Thank you so much. Let's give you a big All right, our next presenter. Very excited to have Kirsten LaPaglia. Did I say it right? Yep. Forget the G. That's what I told you. That's right. Just has been the director for the STEM Access Project in TRIO Inspire since 2006. You've been around a while. That's awesome. STEM Access delivers STEM experiences that inspire transformation and personal empowerment for Idaho youth by providing supportive spaces, engaging community, and real-world learning via student-relevant problems. Sounds awesome. Funded projects include TRIO Upward Math Science, which prepares Lewis-Clark Valley High School participants for college and STEM careers. With individual services in academic year and an academic STEM camps, we learned a little bit more about that today in the summer. The NESB, all these acronyms, support, which reaches youth across Idaho with a robotics team challenge that includes an annual hub event on campus in the early summer. We're looking forward to that. And the science intern scholarship programs in geology and biophysics. Kirsten has worked as a research associate in the veterinary science department at Washington State University and co-founded a public charter school using experiential learning education. She has an MS in biology from Nuremberg University in Germany, an MS in curriculum and instruction, an Idaho school teaching certification from our beloved U of I. And she's currently pursuing a PhD in education, researching motivation for science learning in adolescence, which is going really well. Right? One of the dissertation things, isn't that right? Yeah. Writing that last little thing. So we are very glad to have Kirsten with us to share a little bit more. So welcome.
Thank you. How do I confirm that folks can see the slideshow? I can see that you guys cannot see the slideshow. Okay, that's not helpful. And I need tech help. I pulled it up here and I think the Zoom can see it, but you can't. There's a chat message.
Well, what they want then. We can see it virtual on our end.
All right.
That's great. So let's see which one works.
Well, it's that one.
This one?
It just needs to pop up there as well.
You know, a lot of screens up here. Okay, so you can see it on Zoom.
It's a two-screen situation, so
This is your personal. Okay, I don't know how to put it on the PowerPoint.
How did you guys have this before? How does it show up there and then get shared?
Well,
It just was
close the.
I think I might not have presented.
So
Do you wanna
let's stop
see
share.
it?
Yeah.
So this is on, so we updated hers.
Okay, so
But I don't know how to get it on here.
yeah, I made it so that before PowerPoint, you can present your view here and then.
I don't know how to do that.
Just unplug it, doesn't work.
That's fine. I wonder, I have an idea. You can probably push it to the second screen.
Yeah.
There we go.
Is that the trick?
Still being shared?
Oh, good. Nice job, let's get you from beginning. Okay, cool. Okay. Oh. I need a clock, otherwise I'll go wait. Okay, so I'm gonna start with, yep, I'm at the end of my dissertation. You will hear just a little bit of it. I've been around for so long that I've been really enfolding a lot of research endeavors into my work, and so you're gonna hear a bit of different pieces and how it all connects, also to the college. And the other thing is, thank you for getting us started with looking at rural spaces. If we focus on Idaho, a lot of our northern Idaho or Idaho in general is rural. And one of the key research interests,
Other computer.
Other computer. I need to see multiple slides, otherwise I won't tell you my story, right? Anyway, so my research interest is in motivation to learn science or STEM in adolescence. And really a big reason for that is that while we know quite a bit about
She said, go ahead and keep talking.
well, we know quite a bit about learning and science in schools in general. There's not very much known about really actually what motivates us to engage in science learning long term, or how science learning in school then influences where we go into careers or the other way around. Here's my arrows. Okay, this is getting very techy. And then in general, I'm very interested then about how that gets then informed back into curriculum design, because ultimately I'm directing a project and that's my passion, designing learning spaces where people get into science on all these different levels. I was supposed to change the slide. Now the arrows don't work. I need a lot of text.
Click, just click,
Just
find
click.
find your arrow.
Which click? The arrow click.
No. Your mouse, find
My
your,
mouse, there's no
Yes.
mouse. The trackpad. Nope. I'm so sorry.
there you go.
Ah,
Now click, there you go.
there you go. Okay, cool. Well, this is the academic view on motivation. I'm looking at the construct of motivation, which has kind of two elements: the how motivated are we, the level, the activation level, and that motivation is always looking at something towards something. You know, what are we motivated towards? And my interest is to look at how we motivated to engage in STEM or science learning, maybe on a daily basis. How does it motivate us to engage in literacy? When we listen to something in the media, are we actually engaging in scientific thinking? Or how does it relate to STEM career performance and engagement? Okay, very specifically, in my research, I'm using the self-determination theory, which is pretty well researched, and it's one version of looking at motivation. There's a few theories out there. I find this very practical for what I'm looking into because it provides well-researched subconstructs all the way from amotivation to multiple extrinsic motivations to full extrinsic motivation to full intrinsic motivation. And there's questions and surveys and instruments out there that I can use to then assess these different sub-motivational factors. And the other piece of the self-determination theory, other than the continuum, is that Ryan and DC, who developed this, talk about how it's been pretty well shown that underneath motivation are these psychological needs, and they show up in different versions in other theories of relatedness. You know, how do we relate to people around that topic that we're motivated towards? How competent do we feel, or are we? And then the autonomy, how much do we have freedom of choice? Kind of a very rough way of talking about these basic three clusters of psychological needs. Okay, so this is an overview. I'm not going to talk about the details. This is kind of a rubric I created on what do we know about science education and how do we look at it with that lens? If I look at all the stuff that we know about adolescence and science education, these are a few examples of how related it plays a role, competency or autonomy. And then most interesting to me is what is actually supporting our motivation, what is a motivational threat. One example, just read an example this morning again, this is a lot of females might get negative feedback about going into STEM careers, so that's a motivational threat, for example, or maybe relevance. Some folks, even if you don't feel very drawn normally, if something's really relevant in your daily life, you might be very motivated to learn something and engage in that. So I'll get back to this rubric later. Here is the dissertation study that I'm working on, which is taking all that into an explanatory sequential study. I've surveyed Inner Mountain, Inner Northwest, undergraduate college students who are in science classes, regardless of their STEM career orientation, so STEM majors and non-STEM majors. 235 of them, I surveyed them on the AMS motivational, on the motivational factors I showed you, and analyzed them for differences based on what career they're interested in, to see if there's differences in level for these different motivational factors. And I've also interviewed 21 folks, both from careers that are directly science or more science related career orientations. And so I'm comparing the two. I want to know if my main research question is, does it make a difference in how we're motivated to learn science based on the career? We could jump on the train and go, of course it makes a difference. If you are not a STEM major, why would you be interested in learning science? Whoa, that's kind of trouble for, right? Really? But the other way around, okay, what does that mean? How do we actually get people motivated to do science if they're not really in a STEM major and there's not an obvious maybe reason in our traditional thinking around that? So that's what I'm interested in, fleshing out these differences. Okay, how does this all relate to STEM access? There were questions earlier about what is this, how does it connect to our work? So here's an example. Don't worry about the details. I highlighted a few blue things. When we do our grant writing, which you always hear about every 5 years, we work intensely on logic models, which you're probably familiar with as a way that we then can assess the outcomes of an actual educational program. And a lot of that is more informal evaluation, but then there's also research pieces. So right smack in the middle, I boxed in there. In my project, I'm going to more intensely look at measuring motivation and changes of motivation and different STEM skills in a way that also I could then do at a research level. So that's kind of where the overlap now starts with how this research stuff even has any relevance to what we do as directors. Okay. Here's a practical example of how I'm already doing this, and a slight detour into a different research piece. So a few years ago, one of the College of Education graduate students, now Dr. Olson, was working with a fishery researcher, also back then in her dissertation, on working with scientist faculty to design educational outreach programs that is more than show and tell. Or here you go ahead and hold the tool and then they come back and go, okay, I did this one thing, but maybe not to the level that the opportunity is there, right? If you're doing something, that's why we're all in this room, because we're excited about how we can do this really well. Okay, so, and they, together we created this collaboration toolbox. We thought in depth, and that was by Dr. Wingerter. What do we need? How do we work with scientists on talking about what good pedagogy looks like? The wording is very different. We have very different language for how we say outcomes or what an objective is, and how to work together effectively as collaborators and even straighten that language out. Anyway, so there's a whole manual that came out of that, mostly by Natasha and Sarah. But I'm using that now, and I'm also using that in connecting with my whole assessment umbrella that I have in that logic model. In, for example, that geology internship. So that is, I have 3 educational outreach pieces that are funded towards some of our STEM access salaries, and there's money in there for us to have that outreach collaboration piece where I'm using these tools. And one was the geology internship. And I'm using this rubric there with my scientist faculty in the beginning to actually just have like a place to talk about, you know, how are you motivated to learn science? And when scientists are starting to talk about that, there's this whole wonderful concept of scientist identity you might be aware of. Then that creates a really good platform to then realize that it's not so easy to just create meaningful education. And then I can work effectively with them as the education outreach expert, and they then being the scientist expert on figuring out how we coordinate these week or 2 week long internships in a way that we can create meaningful, good, rich pedagogical education where they come out in the end with high motivation of science learning. Okay, that's the idea. The other internship this year, for the first time, we had 2 run parallel, biophysics and geology, and I used my survey that I used for my dissertation on measuring the motivational factors, and this is just a mini snapshot for you to see that I'm starting to do this. And you can see that in light blue all the way on the right, the intrinsic motivation, so that motivation of like, yeah, I like learning science just for the fun of it, or like I'm enjoying discovering things, that just do it because it's kind of a joyful thing and nobody's making me, which is really what we need in out of school education, because otherwise they don't come. Is actually pretty high, so we did a pretty good job. And there down below you just see who participated and what their career interests are, because I asked that same question that I'm asking my dissertation survey people, what careers are you interested in? I'm not telling them actually I'm looking for if it's science or not. I'm just saying, hey, what career are you interested in? So we make a great effort. 5 minutes? Oh, we make a great effort on in our STEM Access project to not recruit towards STEM, and that is not our goal. In TRIO, our goal is to prepare students for college or whatever career life they choose. It is their choice, and we're there for the people. So I just want to emphasize that. It's also one reason why I look at science learning not as career-driven or goal as have the career be the goal. Okay. Here is an example of more informal assessment that we do. The last day, I bring all the staff together. This has been happening for a few years now. This year was fun because we had these 3 internships and 3 staff and 5 grad students involved. And then we did on our Inspire values. One of them is transformation. We have 5 of them that drives what we do. And so this is just 1 out of 5 posters of what we want to achieve, and that's transformation. And I just talked about what these values are, and then I invited everybody to stick Post-its up front. It was really fun. It was very similar to what you experienced here. And these are examples of what people said. And I love this one that Anna says, or towards Anna, it wasn't written anonymous. Seeing Anna so excited to learn helped motivate me to do my best. And yeah, that makes me feel great because it's proven in the literature and I see it everywhere. This is great evidence that we made a difference right there. Okay, now, how does this relate to the college? I think is my next piece. Yes. Okay, so I'm going to jump into a different project that I have going that you might have heard about, the NASA NESP program. Susan Stauffer is the associate director. She's on leave, so she's not here today, but this is a great example where maybe it also shows more where, other than all my talking and opportunities you see, this relates to what the college does. We had a STEM challenge event that we created with various collaborators and put on with NESP money, that NASA money that I have out of the SUP award, not from nearby NASA, but from a different NASA program, the CWU. And we did this whole one-day event right after COVID, which was exciting to people locally. This was one of the first in-person bigger events with, I think, 80 people came. It was well received. And they all did this whole, basically the NASA NESP curriculum. So we told them all we're going to do it, all kinds of STEM challenges around the topic of you pretend you fly up a rocket to Moon or Mars, and then have to like land your rocket and then drive around with robots. And so one of the activities was simulating a flight path. So they had these apps, William Tye, our very own William Tye, did this activity. He's fantastic at it. It was a whole all around math. So they had these math app, they simulated the landing and then they launched these trebuchets. And then another activity, we used the movement science spaces to run robots on maps. They had to learn a very excellent low threshold programming system that we had with these EV3 robots, and we're driving robots around. This is the wrong picture. Here's the robots, right? Before we drive the robots around, you have to fly your rocket, and so that was we used drones. Eric was one of the people who helped create these cool parkours, obstacle paths where they had to fly the drones up, and then there were things hanging off the drones with magnets, and they had to like pick things up and drop things, but it's all virtual. So, and they had to think about what they're doing. And then once that was landed, it wasn't quite so cohesive because it was more different stations. But here is then the robot that you then start having driving on these spaces. And these are maps from our project that are actually printed maps from Mars or Moon. And then at the end of the day, Dr. Barnes from the University of Idaho was going to fly an actual big, like vehicle-sized drone to Titan in like 10 years. It's a super exciting project. He held a presentation, and the students, I've done this a long time, and I always see people generally be interested, but that was fantastic because his presentation, almost without planning, touched base on every single thing they did that day. He talked about how he has to virtually test, how to virtually predict flight paths for the rockets. They did that. Then they have to drop the vehicle, how then to like drive it around, how he has to program all that. So he like touched base on every single thing that these students did. And so we tried our best to like bring all these concepts in that are more than just the fun of the toys, right? Yeah, that was that.
Great questions. Anything? First, while Heather gets set up. Well, one of the things I wanted to mention is Matt and I just spent some time in McCall at Moss. And one of the things that we're hoping to do in the college is to create a joint appointment between the College of Natural Resources and the College of Education to have a science educator who is working at Moss with their masters in natural resources students who would then leave the program not only with their MNR, but also certified to teach science. And so I'm really interested in this framework that you've developed to help interface between scientists, right, and the educational pedagogical part of that. And so I'm really curious if we get this, I'm going to make this pitch today. So let's hope we all say good thoughts, that my pitch gets approved, and talk about how that those might interface. So I think that sounds great. Our partners at Moss will benefit. Yeah, conversation on this. So yeah. Okay. That would be awesome. Let's talk about that. All right.
I think you got it.
Oh, imagine it. So good. Good tech, friends. Well, I want to introduce Heather May, who has been working in higher ed for more than 16 years. She's been working in federal TRIO programs since 2008 and is currently the director of the Benoit-Letah Upward Bound at the University of Idaho. In addition to her work with TRIO, she's pursuing a PhD in adult organizational learning and leadership with a focus on trauma-informed practice in higher education. In addition to her work at the U of I, she consults, presents, and provides training on higher education, on topics of trauma-informed approaches for organizations, student service, and leadership. And outside of work, she stays busy raising her amateur paleontologists who are 10 and 4. That's fun. So fun. Well, let's welcome Heather.
Thanks for being here and listening to me today. I often say, when I introduce myself, my name is Heather Eva May. I study trauma. I'm lots of fun at parties. So a little bit about why I do what I do, because I wanted to put in a little bit of my positionality. So I'm a first-generation college student. I have a pretty decent background in personal childhood adversity, and I went to college without knowing what I was doing. And I was in a major that is traditionally occupied by fairly privileged people. And I made so many mistakes, so many missteps. And eventually I found my way out of vocal performance. I used to be an opera singer, and into feminist studies, LGBT studies, and kind of studying systemic barriers to everything. So that's a little bit about me. When I joined TRIO full-time after a couple of years, Scott was like, Heather, you really do need to finish your master's degree. So because I dropped out of my master's in 2008. So I was like, okay, I'll do that. And I met with Laura Holyoke, who, brought me in, and for my master's project, she says, hey, I think looking at adverse childhood experiences would be really relevant to the work that you do. And then I started studying it, and all of a sudden I had a name to everything I had really experienced in college and growing up. And so it really illuminated to me this need for, and at the time I was like, we need this in high schools because, 7, 8 years ago, this was primarily in elementary education, moving into the middle schools. And then as we got through it, I was like, you know what? We need this in college. We need college students to have this. And so I started developing, after I finished my master's, I started developing these presentations and trainings for folks so they could do this with college students. And then I was like, oh, man, we need this for us. We need to be trauma informed with each other because particularly for TRIO, we are asked in our legislation and regulation to recruit staff from TRIO-like backgrounds. And my thought is, and this isn't based on research, this is based off of personal experience, that folks from TRIO-like backgrounds probably are more likely to have adversity in their background or a little higher rates of adversity. And if we're bringing things and we're becoming more inclusive as higher education, we need to understand how to work with each other, how to go from, what's wrong with this person to what happened to this person. And that's the trauma-informed approach. So let's see. Uh-oh.
You just gotta move your mouse onto it, click it.
I'm moving my mouse.
You are off the screen because the thing is on the second screen and you can't see.
Oh, there we go. So the problems. So pre-pandemic statistics, an estimated 50 to 90% of the general population, not TRIO population, the general population have had adverse experiences or trauma. 2/3 of children, regardless of socioeconomic status, first-gen status, have experienced at least one traumatic event. This is pre-COVID statistics. This is like 2015. And trauma and early life adversity is associated with a wide variety of not just health risk factors, but social risk factors as well. Completing college, financial literacy is one of them, kind of the predilection of engaging in riskier behaviors like substance use or even risky sexual behaviors. So these are all pieces to that puzzle. And then trauma-informed services, again, like I said earlier, have been implemented in K-12 settings and recently are becoming more, people are becoming more open to them in the higher ed setting. But social services, health services, those is where it started out of into the K-12 system, and then we need it here now. The other pieces are, historically, higher education has been and has not been an inclusive space. So as we talk about inclusivity, as we promote inclusivity, we don't often address the foundational issues that create invisible barriers for all folks, people of color, women, and folks with high adversity. Cultures of shame and toxicity within the work environment. That's pretty, everybody knows, everybody's experienced that in higher education, as well as issues around emotional and psychological safety and trust. This became really, really evident to me, especially, did anybody during COVID shutdown join that Facebook group of, higher ed professionals during COVID? And it was just all of this mass exodus, toxicity, shame. People were leaving the professions in super high numbers. And I think part of this is that our expectations of staff, our expectations of faculty are not matching what the stressors are and the backgrounds that folks have. So we have this exit era, we're facing this now. There's so many jobs that need to be filled that people aren't in them. And so my general areas of interest, and so right now I was going to be doing my preliminary exams over the summer, but as folks know who work in TRIO, summer is a bit hectic, working 70-hour weeks, and I told Laura Holyoke, I was like, I'm sorry, I cannot do this summer. So, so after, I think in a few weeks, because I am on 3 conference presentations that are being presented in 11 days, we will be going back to the, okay, what are you gonna do for your prelims? So these are my general areas that I'm looking at right now. Organizational change and trauma-informed approaches, trauma-informed leadership, trauma-informed approaches as a strategy to promote belonging and inclusivity on campuses, and organizational safety and trust in institutions of higher education. And so it's been really difficult for me to narrow down on what I want to do, because it's like, everything is so necessary and needed, and I'm gonna change. And I'm like, no, I just need to write a dissertation. So what I want to know is basically what happens when institutions of higher education or organizations and units within institutions of higher education move toward becoming trauma informed. Not all of a sudden, oh, you go to a 1-hour session and all of a sudden you're trauma informed. Process. What does participating in trauma informed professional development, how does it affect the organizational culture in an office or unit within higher education? How do staff and faculty, how do their perceptions of trust and safety shift in an organization after that type of professional development? As well as in what ways can these approaches be supportive of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in higher education? So I have a pretty broad desire. It all kind of relates, but I just need to sit down right now. So current research projects are kind of along these lines. And so right now I've been working with the research apprenticeship in AOLL and Dr. Holyoke. And so last year we started a Profound Moments group, building on the work that Dr. Proth and Dr. Karchelman have done in profound learning and leadership, and using that as a model. And so what we did was we proposed a framework, a theoretical framework for what are those moments, and differentiating between transformational moments and profound. And so we presented on that last year at the AAA's conference in Florida. We will be presenting again on this topic in Wisconsin at the AAA's conference in 10 or 11 days. And so the next piece is the exploring the roots of profound moments as an empirical study. And so that will be led by Erin Ball, who is a doctoral student as well in the ALL program. So that is the research that we're doing right now, talking to people about these experiences that they have and how they deepen over time. The next piece is, so even though I'm not doing my prelims, I did do 2 additional studies, or am doing currently 2 additional studies with Dr. Holyoke that we then brought into the research apprenticeship on trauma-informed practice. And so this is another presentation that will be at the AAA's conference in a week and a half, designed for students, necessary for adults. So we are currently coding qualitative interviews with professionals that we have delivered a training to see how it relates to their work and how they've been applying it. And then also, Dr. Holyoke and I have been creating and delivering some of these professional development trainings for a little while now, also infusing training with meaningfulness and essential caring for learning, how creating meaningful experiences in professional development may or may not connect in one of those pieces. And then just a little plug for what we've been doing over the last few years. Some of the presentations we've done is organismic biocracy, fostering a healthy workplace. Humane systems approaches, organismic capacity building from practice to policy. Building team resilience and well-being, moving toward communities of care. Trauma-informed teaching and learning, and we did 2 of these sessions for CEDL last academic year. Creating communities of care, providing trauma-informed services, which is one that I developed for the Bannock Youth Foundation in Pocatello, an organization that serves teenagers with substance use issues. And then This is a fun one I did for a trio conference, Beyond Bubble Baths, Practical Strategies for Self-Care for Trio Professionals. Trauma-informed advising, and I did this in 2020 and 2021 for both Police Pathways, which is a local organization, as well as Idaho State University trio programs that serve adult populations. And then trauma-informed leadership and supervision, which was a post pre-conference that the Northwest Association of Educational Opportunities asked me to do in 2020. And I think, oh, and there's more. Sustainable service, becoming trauma-informed organization, utilizing relational mindfulness, which was the first training that we started developing. And so those are just kind of the interests. They connect to TRIO insofar as our students and our staff, and we all kind of come from backgrounds with a variety of experiences, both adverse and positive, and we need to learn how to, as Dr. Holyoke and I say in our trainings, human better together. How do we do that in higher education?
Few minutes for questions.
Yes.
I don't have a question, I have a request. Nothing to do, I guess. Could we make this Beyond Bubble Baths presentation happen again, please?
Yeah.
Worldwide, or I don't know, worldwide. That's why.
Yeah, that'd be great.
I could do that.
I would love that.
There's eating involved. Yeah.
Yes.
Eating is
We're
here
here.
for it. So you need some money for that, I'll find it.
Chocolate, I hope.
Sometimes.
Was that the cotton candy?
Yeah.
Was that the like the
Yes.
marshmallows?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
and
yes,
the
okay. Oh, they're all raving.
They did that, yeah.
They loved it.
Well, when you give people food.
Well, or also when you tell them like how to take care of themselves, also kind of
Yes.
informative. I'm really curious, are you looking for an organ? So if you go back to the questions you asked, like what you're really interested in was kind of the arrows that went down. You know, where are you gonna do that?
That's a good question. I don't know. Because it's kind of hard to do research where you live a little bit. You don't want to, you know, ruffle feathers too much. So that's a good question. Don't exactly know. There are a few approaches that we're kind of looking at right now, not necessarily doing a training intervention and then a research study, but maybe looking at folks who have already been in trainings or engaged in professional development, not necessarily by us, but because what we have found is that there is a wide range of trauma-informed professional development. Some people say, oh yeah, we're a trauma-informed organization now. We have an hour-long session. The trainings that we have developed are 16 hours. So there's a wide variety of what it means, so. Yeah.
Well, and even if you don't use our college as the research site, which I understand all of the many things that are at play here, I do think it's of an interest if we could talk about how some of this might be infused into college.
Sure.
That would be really quite cool. So starting with not just bubble baths, but some other things about how we might engage in this 16 hours of training over time for those who are interested. I think
There's an action planning component.
Okay,
Yeah.
this is great. This is awesome.
Any other
Maybe one more-
questions?
Sorry, one more question.
I'm just happy to volunteer if you do research studies and you happy to take classes for it and I'll tell you about it.
Yay, yay.
Yeah.
I'm